Mocked and cast aside, the rejected Omega had no idea she was destined to become the Alpha King's mate. The knife came down hard on the wooden table, missing Elena's fingers by less than an inch. "Next time I will not miss," said Ivy, smiling as if she had just told a pleasant joke instead of a threat. "Peel faster, Omega. The guests will be here soon, and I will not let you shame this family with your slowness." Elena did not answer. She had learned years ago that silence was safer than words. She picked up another potato and kept peeling, her hands steady even though her heart was pounding. The kitchen was hot and smoky, filled with the smell of roasting meat that she would not be allowed to taste. Tonight there was a gathering of pack elders at the house, and as always, Elena would serve the food, clean the floors, and disappear before anyone noticed she existed. She was 18 years old, and for as long as she could remember, she had been treated like a burden rather than a daughter. Her mother had died giving birth to her, and her father, grieving and lost, had remarried a woman named Marla within 2 years. Marla brought with her 2 daughters of her own, Ivy and Bree, both strong betas with sharp tongues and sharper claws. When Elena's scent turned out to be Omega instead of Beta or Alpha, the entire household treated it as a personal insult, as if she had chosen her rank simply to embarrass them. In the Thornwood pack, Omegas were considered the lowest rank a wolf could carry. They could not fight well, could not lead, and according to the old beliefs, could not be trusted with anything important. Elena had grown up hearing this so many times that some nights she almost believed it herself. "Are you even listening to me?" Ivy snapped, snatching the peeled potato from Elena's hand and inspecting it as if searching for a flaw. "Honestly, I don't know why Father keeps you around. You eat our food, sleep under our roof, and give nothing back." "I clean this whole house," Elena said quietly. "I cook every meal, I care for the animals. I don't eat much of anything you couldn't spare." Ivy's eyes narrowed. For a moment, Elena thought she had gone too far. Then Bree walked into the kitchen, drying her hands on a cloth, and rolled her eyes at the sight of them. "Don't waste your breath arguing with a servant," Bree said. "Just finish the vegetables, Elena. Mother wants everything ready before sunset." Elena nodded and went back to work, swallowing the words that wanted to come out. There was no point defending herself in this house. She had tried before, years ago, and each time it had only made things worse. Her stepmother would remind her, coldly and calmly, that she was fortunate to have a roof over her head at all. An unclaimed Omega, with no pack of her own blood to protect her, could easily end up with nothing. By evening, the house was full of guests, laughter, and the low hum of pack business being discussed over food and wine. Elena moved through the rooms like a shadow, refilling cups, clearing plates, keeping her eyes down. Nobody looked at her twice. She had become so good at being invisible that sometimes she wondered if she was even still there, or if she had slowly faded into nothing over the years. It was during a quiet moment on the back porch, escaping the noise for just a few minutes, that she overheard 2 of the elders talking near the garden gate. "They say the Alpha King himself will be holding a bonding ceremony," one of them said. "Every unmated wolf in the 8 packs is invited. Can you imagine? A chance to be chosen by Cade Ashriver." "The whole kingdom will be there," the other replied. "Every alpha, every beta, hoping to catch his eye. Not that it matters for most of us. A king's mate is chosen by fate, not by hoping." Elena stood frozen by the porch railing. She had heard stories about the Alpha King before, whispered around fires, and passed between pack members, like treasured secrets. Cade Ashriver ruled over all 8 packs of the region, a wolf so powerful that no alpha dared challenge him, yet so fair that even the smallest packs trusted his judgment. It was said he had never taken a mate, that he was waiting for the one his wolf recognized as his own, guided by a bond older than the packs themselves. Elena had never imagined such a ceremony could include someone like her, but something about the idea, however impossible, made her chest ache with a longing she could not explain. Just once, she wanted to stand somewhere and be seen, truly seen, not as an unwanted Omega, but as a person. She was still standing there when Marla found her. "Eavesdropping now, are we?" her stepmother said, arms crossed. "Get back inside. The elders will want dessert soon." "I heard about the bonding ceremony," Elena said before she could stop herself. "Will we be attending?" Marla's laugh was sharp and cold. "We will be attending, yes. Ivy and Bree have every chance of catching an alpha's notice. You, however, will stay here and manage the house while we are gone. It would be embarrassing for an Omega from this family to appear at such an important event. People would talk. Elena said nothing. She turned and walked back into the noisy house, back into her invisible life, and told herself that dreaming of things she could never have would only bring her pain. But that night, lying on her narrow bed in the small room near the kitchen, she could not stop thinking about the ceremony. She thought about what it might feel like to stand among thousands of wolves, just once, without anyone knowing her name or her rank. Nobody would recognize her there. Nobody would know she was the Omega everyone in Thornwood Pack liked to forget. The idea took root and would not let go. 3 days before the family was set to leave for the capital, Elena began quietly preparing. She had a small amount of coin saved from selling herbs she gathered in the forest, money her stepfamily did not know about. She found an old traveling cloak in a storage chest, plain and gray, the kind no one would look at twice. She told herself she was not really going to do it. She told herself this every night, right up until the morning the family's carriage pulled away from the house, leaving her alone, with instructions to clean every room before their return. She stood in the empty house for a long moment after they left. Then she went to her room, put on the gray cloak, and walked out the door, before she could talk herself out of it. The road to the capital was longer than she expected, but Elena had never been afraid of hard travel. She joined a group of merchants heading in the same direction, offering to help care for their pack animals in exchange for safe company on the road. Nobody asked too many questions. Nobody looked closely enough to see the fear and excitement mixed together in her eyes. By the time she reached the capital, 2 days later, her legs ached and her stomach was tight with nerves, but she had made it. The city was unlike anything she had ever seen. Tall stone buildings, wide streets filled with wolves from every pack imaginable, banners bearing the crest of the Alpha King snapping in the wind. Elena pulled her hood low and let herself be carried along by the crowd, amazed and terrified in equal measure. The ceremony was to be held in the great courtyard at the center of the city, a space large enough to hold thousands. Elena arrived early and found a spot near the back, close to the stone wall, where she could watch without being seen. As the hours passed, the courtyard filled until it seemed like every wolf in the kingdom had come. Alphas in fine clothing stood near the front, confident and proud. Betas gathered in groups, whispering and hoping. Even a few Omegas were scattered here and there, though far fewer than the other ranks, and Elena noticed how some of them were pushed toward the edges just as she had positioned herself. She did not expect anything to happen to her. She had come only to see, to feel for one evening what it might be like to be part of something larger than her small, unwanted life. That was enough. That would have to be enough. A horn sounded, low and deep, echoing off the stone walls, and the crowd fell into an eager hush. Elena rose onto her toes, trying to see over the heads in front of her. At the far end of the courtyard, a tall figure appeared on a raised platform, and even from this distance, Elena could feel the weight of his presence settle over the crowd like a held breath. Cade Ashriver was exactly as the stories described, and somehow still more than she had imagined. He was tall, with dark hair, and eyes that seemed to catch the torchlight even from far away. He moved with the quiet confidence of someone who had never once doubted his own strength. When he spoke, his voice carried effortlessly across the entire courtyard, calm and steady, the voice of someone used to being heard. "Tonight," he said, "fate will choose what politics and power cannot decide. I ask only that you stand still, and let the bond, if it exists, make itself known." A ripple of excitement moved through the crowd. Elena watched, transfixed, as the king stepped down from the platform and began to walk slowly among the gathered wolves, his head tilted slightly, as if listening for something only he could hear. Elena told herself she was perfectly safe here, hidden among thousands of others, invisible as she had always been. She watched the king move closer through the crowd, section by section, and felt a strange, nervous curiosity rise in her chest, wondering who among this vast gathering would be the one his instincts recognized. She was so lost in watching him that she did not immediately notice the way the crowd around her had begun to shift and part, as if invisible hands were clearing a path. She did not notice the way whispers had started nearby, quiet and confused. She only noticed when the king stopped walking, completely and suddenly, his entire body going still, his eyes lifting and finding hers across the remaining distance between them. For one long, terrifying moment, Elena could not breathe. The noise of the crowd seemed to fade into nothing. Every instinct in her body screamed that something had just happened, something enormous and irreversible, though she did not yet understand what. The king's eyes held hers, and in them she saw something that looked almost like disbelief, as if he too could not quite accept what his own senses were telling him. Someone nearby gasped, then another. The crowd began to murmur, heads turning to follow the king's gaze, trying to see who had captured his attention so completely. Elena's heart slammed against her ribs. She was not supposed to be seen. She was not supposed to be noticed at all. And yet here she was, standing in the open, the object of an alpha king's undivided focus, with thousands of eyes now turning toward her one by one. Panic rose in her chest, sharp and immediate. This could not be real. This could not be happening to her, the unwanted Omega, the girl who peeled potatoes and scrubbed floors, and existed only at the edges of other people's lives. There had to be some mistake, some trick of the crowd, some other wolf standing near her that the king was truly looking at. The king took a step forward. That single step broke whatever spell had been holding Elena in place. Fear overtook every other feeling, and before she could think clearly about what she was doing, she turned and pushed her way back through the crowd, desperate to disappear the way she always had, desperate to escape whatever strange, impossible thing had just happened. She heard her name called, though of course that was impossible, because nobody here knew her name. She heard the crowd's murmurs rising into something louder, more excited, more urgent. She kept moving, weaving between bodies, her hood slipping from her head as she ran, her cloak catching on something and tearing free. By the time she reached the edge of the courtyard, her lungs were burning, and her legs felt weak beneath her. She did not stop to look back. She ran through the dark streets of the capital, past torchlit buildings and startled onlookers, until the noise of the ceremony faded far behind her, and the only sound left was her own ragged breathing. Only when she finally slowed, hidden in the shadow of a quiet alley far from the courtyard, did she realize what she had dropped in her panic. A small wooden token, carved with her mother's initials, the only thing she still carried, that had once belonged to her family. It had fallen somewhere in that crowd, somewhere near the spot where the Alpha King had stopped and stared at her, as if the whole world had shifted beneath his feet. Elena pressed her back against the cold stone wall and closed her eyes, trying to steady her breathing, trying to convince herself that whatever had just happened meant nothing at all. But deep inside, in a place she rarely let herself listen to, something told her that her life had already changed forever, and there would be no going back to the girl who peeled potatoes in a quiet kitchen, waiting to be forgotten. She did not yet know that the token she had dropped carried her scent, clear and unmistakable, and that somewhere behind her, an Alpha King stood frozen in the courtyard, staring at the empty space where she had disappeared, already certain of one thing beyond all doubt. He would not stop searching until he found her. Cade Ashriver stood in the middle of the courtyard, long after the crowd had begun to scatter into confused, excited conversation. His hand was closed tightly around a small wooden token, still warm from where it had touched her skin. Her scent clung to it, faint but unmistakable. Wildflowers and rain, a scent unlike anything he had ever known. His wolf paced restlessly beneath his skin, agitated and desperate, urging him to move, to chase, to find her before the trail went cold. "Your Majesty," General Roan said, stepping up beside him with a look of controlled alarm. "The crowd is asking questions. What do we tell them?" Cade did not answer right away. His eyes were fixed on the place where she had vanished into the mass of bodies, swallowed by fear and by the crowd's sudden, overwhelming attention. He understood why she had run. He had felt the shift in the air the moment their eyes met, the unmistakable pull of a true bond, something so rare that most wolves lived and died without ever feeling it once. For her, a stranger with no warning, no explanation, it must have felt like the ground opening beneath her feet. "Tell them the ceremony is concluded for tonight," Cade said finally, his voice low but firm. "Tell them fate has spoken, and that I intend to honor it." Roan's eyebrows rose. "You mean to find her?" "I mean to find her," Cade repeated, "if it takes every soldier in this kingdom." He turned the token over in his palm, studying the two letters carved into its worn surface. Whoever this woman was, she had not come forward proudly, seeking his attention, the way so many others in that courtyard had hoped to. She had run from it. That alone told him something important, something that made his wolf ache with an emotion he did not yet have a name for. Word of what had happened spread through the capital within hours, and by morning, it had reached every corner of the 8 packs. The story grew and changed as it traveled, as stories always do, but the core of it remained the same everywhere it was told. The Alpha King had found his fated mate at the bonding ceremony, and she had fled before he could learn her name. In Thornwood Pack, far from the capital, Elena arrived home 2 days after the ceremony, exhausted and shaken, her mind still spinning with the memory of the king's eyes finding hers across that impossible crowd. She told herself again and again that it had been a mistake, a trick of fate, a moment that would pass and be forgotten. She had not given her name. She had left before anyone could learn who she was. Surely, she thought, that would be the end of it. She slipped back into the house before her stepfamily returned, cleaning every room exactly as she had been instructed, hiding the gray traveling cloak deep in the bottom of an old storage chest where no one would think to look. When Marla, Ivy, and Bree arrived home the following evening, tired and full of stories about the grand ceremony they had attended, Elena listened silently as she served their supper, her heart pounding every time the conversation turned toward what had happened. "You should have seen it," Ivy said, practically glowing with excitement. The whole courtyard went silent. Everyone thought the king was walking toward the front rows, toward one of the noble families, and then he just stopped, right in the middle of the crowd, staring at someone near the back like he had seen a ghost. "Some Omega girl, they say," Bree added, wrinkling her nose in distaste. "Ran off before anyone could even get a look at her face. Can you imagine? Being chosen by the Alpha King himself, and simply running away? What kind of fool does that?" Elena kept her eyes on the floor, her hands steady on the serving tray, despite the way her heart had leapt into her throat. She said nothing. She had learned long ago that silence was the safest response to almost everything in this house. "They say his soldiers are searching every pack in the kingdom," Marla said, sipping her wine with an air of satisfaction. "Whoever she is, I imagine her life is about to become very complicated, assuming they even find her." A crowd that size, at night, in a hooded cloak, she could be anyone. Elena excused herself as soon as she was able, retreating to the small room near the kitchen, where she spent most of her nights. She sat on the edge of her narrow bed, staring at her hands, trying to make sense of what had happened. It had felt real in the moment, the way the king's eyes had locked onto hers, the way the air itself had seemed to change around them. But surely that had only been fear, or exhaustion, or the overwhelming noise and heat of the crowd playing tricks on her senses. She told herself this every night for the next week, and each night, she almost believed it. Life in Thornwood Pack continued, much as it always had. Elena rose before dawn to begin her chores, cared for the animals, cooked meals she would not eat, and endured the small cruelties that had shaped her days for as long as she could remember. Ivy and Bree spoke often of the search for the king's missing mate, treating it as gossip and entertainment, rather than anything that could possibly touch their own household. Elena listened to every word, her stomach twisting with a fear she could not explain to anyone. It was nearly 2 weeks after the ceremony when the first signs of trouble appeared. A merchant passing through the Packlands mentioned, almost in passing, that soldiers bearing the Alpha King's crest had been asking questions in nearby villages, searching for any trace of a young Omega woman who had attended the ceremony in a plain gray cloak. Elena heard this news while gathering water at the well, and the bucket nearly slipped from her hands. She spent that night wide awake, staring at the ceiling of her small room, turning the impossible truth over and over in her mind. If the soldiers were searching this closely, following such specific details, it was only a matter of time before they reached Thornwood Pack itself. And if they did, if anyone thought to question the household, what would happen when they learned that Elena had been away from the house during those very days, that no one could account for her whereabouts during the ceremony? She tried to convince herself that no one would think to ask an unwanted Omega servant such questions. She tried to convince herself that even if they did, there was no way to prove anything, no way to connect her quiet, invisible existence to the extraordinary moment that had occurred in that crowded courtyard. But deep down, in that same quiet place, where she had first felt the truth of what happened, Elena knew that hiding would only work for so long. Fate, once it had chosen a path, rarely allowed itself to be denied so easily. 3 days later, as Elena knelt in the garden pulling weeds from around the vegetable beds, she heard the sound of horses approaching the house, more horses than usual, moving with the disciplined rhythm of soldiers rather than the casual pace of merchants or travelers. She rose slowly, brushing dirt from her hands, and watched as a group of riders came into view along the road, their cloaks bearing an emblem she recognized instantly from the stories, a silver wolf's head against a field of deep blue, the crest of the Alpha King himself. Her breath caught in her throat. For a moment, she considered running, disappearing into the forest at the edge of the property, the way she sometimes did when the house grew too unbearable. But her feet remained rooted to the spot, some instinct deeper than fear holding her in place, as if some part of her had always known this moment would come. The riders slowed as they reached the house, and their leader, a tall man with sharp eyes and the bearing of someone accustomed to command, dismounted and approached the front door. Marla emerged onto the porch, smoothing her dress and arranging her features into the polite, welcoming expression she reserved for anyone of importance. "Good afternoon," the soldier said, his voice carrying easily across the yard. "We are here on the king's business. We are searching for a young Omega woman who may have traveled through this territory recently. Any information would be greatly appreciated." Marla's smile widened, though Elena, watching from the garden, could see the calculation behind her stepmother's eyes. Of course. Please, come in. My daughters would be delighted to assist in any way they can." Ivy and Bree appeared in the doorway almost immediately, clearly having been listening from inside, both of them straightening their posture and arranging their expressions into something they no doubt believed looked appropriately helpful and attractive. Elena watched as Marla gestured toward her daughters, practically presenting them for inspection, as if the soldiers might simply decide one of them was close enough to whatever description they carried. "These are my daughters," Marla said. "Fine young betas, both of them. Surely one of them might be of some use to you." The lead soldier's expression remained carefully neutral, though something flickered behind his eyes that Elena could not quite read. "We appreciate your hospitality, but the woman we seek carries a very specific scent, one that cannot be mistaken for another. If you would permit us, we would like to walk the grounds, simply as a formality." Marla, clearly eager to appear cooperative, and perhaps hoping such cooperation might reflect well on her household, agreed readily. The soldiers began to move through the property, and Elena, still frozen at the edge of the garden, felt her heart pounding so loudly she was certain everyone nearby must be able to hear it. She thought about slipping away into the trees, while their attention was elsewhere, but something held her in place, some quiet certainty that running now would only delay the inevitable, and might make things worse when the truth eventually came to light. So she remained where she was, kneeling among the vegetables, doing her best to appear as unremarkable and unimportant as she had trained herself to seem for her entire life. It did not work. One of the soldiers, a younger man walking near the edge of the garden, stopped abruptly. Elena watched his head lift, his nostrils flaring slightly, his entire posture shifting from casual patrol to sudden sharp attention. He turned toward her slowly, his eyes widening with a mixture of disbelief and dawning excitement. "Sir," he called out, his voice unsteady. "Sir, I believe we've found her." Every head in the yard turned toward the garden, toward Elena, kneeling in the dirt in her plain work dress, dirt smudged across her hands and cheek, looking nothing at all like anyone's idea of a king's chosen mate. The lead soldier crossed the distance between them quickly, stopping several feet away, and studying her with an intensity that made her want to disappear into the ground itself. "Your name," he said, though it sounded less like a question, and more like a confirmation he already expected. Elena's mouth had gone completely dry. Behind the soldiers, she could see Marla's face transforming from polite hospitality into something closer to shock, and beyond her, Ivy and Bree stood frozen in matching expressions of disbelief. "Elena," she managed to say, her voice barely above a whisper. "My name is Elena." The soldier's face broke into an expression of profound relief, and without another word, he lowered himself to one knee in the dirt of the garden, his companions quickly following his example. Elena stared at them, kneeling before her in a vegetable patch behind a house that had never once treated her as anything more than an unwanted burden, and felt the entire world tilt sideways beneath her feet. On behalf of His Majesty, Alpha King Cade Ashriver, the soldier said, his voice steady and formal, despite the strangeness of the moment. We are honored to have found you at last. The silence that followed was so complete that Elena could hear her own pulse hammering in her ears. Marla stood on the porch, one hand pressed against her chest, her mouth slightly open as if she could not quite process what she was seeing. Ivy and Bree had gone pale, their earlier confidence draining away as the reality of the moment settled over the yard like a heavy fog. There must be some mistake, Marla said finally, her voice higher than usual, edged with something close to panic. Elena is our household help. She is an Omega, a servant. Surely you are looking for someone of higher standing. The lead soldier rose from his kneeling position, his expression calm but unmistakably firm. There is no mistake, madam. The scent is unmistakable, confirmed by a token she left behind at the ceremony. This is the woman His Majesty has been searching for. Elena stood slowly, brushing dirt from her hands, feeling as though she were watching the scene unfold from somewhere outside her own body. Everything about this moment felt impossible, a strange dream she would surely wake from at any second, finding herself back in her narrow bed, with the sun not yet risen, and another long day of chores stretching out before her. But the soldiers did not disappear. The weight of their attention did not fade. And slowly, painfully, Elena began to understand that this was real, that somehow, against every likelihood her life had ever presented her, she had become the center of something enormous. I don't understand, she said quietly, more to herself than to anyone else. Why would he choose me? The soldier's expression softened slightly, and for the first time, Elena saw something like genuine kindness in his eyes. The bond is not something chosen, my lady, it simply is. His Majesty felt it the moment he saw you, as strongly and as certainly as any bond has ever been felt. He has searched every corner of this kingdom for 2 weeks, hoping to find you. Behind him, Marla had recovered enough of her composure to step forward, her expression shifting rapidly from shock into something more calculating. Well, she said, forcing a smile that did not reach her eyes. This is wonderful news indeed. Elena, dear, you must gather your things immediately. We cannot keep His Majesty waiting. Elena almost laughed at the sudden shift in her stepmother's tone, the abrupt transformation from dismissive contempt to eager cooperation. It would have been funny, she thought, if it were not so painfully familiar. She had spent years being invisible in this house, and now, in the span of a single conversation, she had become valuable enough to matter. I'll gather my things, Elena said quietly, and turned toward the house without waiting for further instruction. She did not have much to pack. Her entire life fit into a small bag, a few worn dresses, the wooden token that matched the one she had lost, though this one had been carved for her father years ago, and a handful of dried herbs she had gathered from the forest. As she moved through the small room that had been her home for as long as she could remember, she felt a strange mixture of relief and fear, uncertain what awaited her beyond these familiar walls, but certain she could not stay here any longer, not now that everything had changed. When she emerged from the house, bag in hand, the soldiers had prepared a horse for her, and Marla stood nearby, her expression carefully arranged into something resembling maternal pride. We are so proud of you, Elena, Marla said, her voice sweet in a way it had never been before. You must remember your family when you rise to your new position. We have always cared for you after all. Elena said nothing, only nodded politely, too overwhelmed by everything happening around her to summon the energy for an argument she had wanted to have for years. She allowed one of the soldiers to help her onto the horse, and as they began the journey toward the capital, she did not look back at the house that had never once felt like home. The journey to the capital passed in a blur of unfamiliar landscapes and quiet, careful conversation with the soldiers escorting her. They treated her with a respect she had never experienced before, addressing her formally, ensuring she had food and rest, speaking of the king with obvious loyalty and admiration. Elena listened to their stories about Cade Ashriver, about his fairness as a ruler, his strength in battle, his patience with matters that required careful thought rather than quick judgment. With each story, her nervousness grew rather than faded, the weight of what awaited her settling more heavily with every mile. They arrived at the capital as evening fell, the city glowing with lantern light, its streets busier and more vibrant than Elena remembered from her brief, frightened visit weeks before. This time, however, she was not slipping through the crowd unnoticed. This time, People turned to watch as her escort passed, whispers following in their wake, word spreading quickly that the king's missing mate had finally been found. The palace itself rose before her like something out of a story, tall towers and wide stone walls, banners bearing the silver wolf crest hanging from every visible surface. Elena felt impossibly small as they approached the main gates, her hands tightening on the edge of her cloak, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and something she could not quite name. She was led through the grand entrance and into a wide hall, where she was told to wait while word was sent to the king himself. The minutes that followed felt endless, Elena standing alone, in a chamber more beautiful than anything she had ever seen, feeling entirely out of place in her simple traveling clothes, dirt still faintly visible beneath her fingernails, from her work in the garden that very morning. When the door finally opened, Elena's breath caught in her throat. Cade Ashriver entered the chamber with the same quiet, commanding presence she remembered from the courtyard, though up close, she could see details she had missed before. The sharp line of his jaw, the intensity in his dark eyes, the way his entire posture seemed to shift the moment he saw her, softening slightly, in a way that surprised her. "You're here," he said, his voice carrying a note of relief so genuine that it caught Elena off guard. "I was beginning to fear I would never find you." "I'm sorry I ran," Elena said, before she could stop herself, the words tumbling out in a rush. "I didn't understand what was happening. I still don't. Entirely." Cade took a slow step closer, stopping at a respectful distance, his eyes studying her face as if trying to memorize every detail. "You have nothing to apologize for. What happened in that courtyard would have overwhelmed anyone. I only wish I could have explained things before you felt the need to flee." Elena did not know how to respond to that. She had spent so many years being spoken to with contempt, or simply ignored altogether, that this gentle, careful attention felt almost foreign, as if she had wandered into someone else's life by mistake. "I don't understand why it's me," she admitted quietly. "I'm an Omega. I've been told my whole life that I'm the lowest rank, that I have nothing to offer anyone. Why would fate choose someone like me to be your mate?" Something flickered across Cade's face, an emotion Elena could not quite identify, though it looked almost like anger, quickly controlled and set aside. "Whoever told you such things was wrong," he said firmly. "The bond does not concern itself with rank or status. It recognizes something deeper, something in the soul rather than the blood. I felt it the moment I saw you, stronger than anything I have ever known. That is not something that happens by mistake." Elena wanted to believe him. Some small, hopeful part of her, a part she had learned long ago to suppress, wanted desperately to believe that she was worth choosing, worth wanting, worth more than the years of dismissal and cruelty she had endured. But years of learned caution held her back, a quiet voice, warning her not to trust too quickly, not to let herself hope for something that might still be taken away. "What happens now?" she asked instead, focusing on something more practical than the overwhelming emotions swirling inside her. "Now," Cade said, "you rest. You are safe here, and no harm will come to you within these walls. Tomorrow, if you are willing, we will speak with the council about formally recognizing the bond. But there is no rush, Elena. I want you to feel certain about this, not pressured into something you are not ready for." His consideration surprised her almost as much as everything else that had happened. She had expected, on some level, to be treated as a prize claimed rather than a person consulted, and his willingness to give her space and choice loosened something tight in her chest that she had not realized she was carrying. That night, in a chamber far grander than anything she had ever slept in, Elena lay awake for a long time, staring at the elaborately carved ceiling above her bed, trying to make sense of the impossible turn her life had taken. Just weeks ago, she had been peeling potatoes in a hot kitchen, dreaming of a single night of freedom at a ceremony she never expected to matter to her at all. Now she lay in the Alpha King's palace, recognized as his fated mate, uncertain of what the future held, but no longer entirely afraid of it. She thought of her step-family, of the years of small cruelties and dismissals, and wondered what they would say if they could see her now. She thought of the soldiers kneeling in her garden, of Cade's gentle patience in the chamber below, of the strange, powerful pull she had felt the moment their eyes first met across that crowded courtyard. For the first time in longer than she could remember, Elena allowed herself to feel something dangerously close to hope. Morning came softly through tall windows framed with heavy curtains, and Elena woke disoriented, momentarily forgetting where she was. The unfamiliar softness of the bed, the sheer size of the room, the quiet efficiency of servants moving somewhere beyond her door, all reminded her within seconds that her life had changed completely overnight. A young woman named Rosalind arrived shortly after Elena woke, introducing herself as one of the palace attendants assigned to assist her. Rosalind was warm and cheerful, moving through the room with practiced efficiency as she laid out clothing far finer than anything Elena had ever owned. "His Majesty asked that I help you prepare for the day," Rosalind explained, holding up a dress of deep blue fabric that seemed to catch the light with every small movement. "There is to be a meeting with the council this afternoon to formally discuss the bond recognition. But first, breakfast, and I imagine you have questions." Elena did have questions, more than she could count, but she found herself hesitant to ask them, uncertain how much she was allowed to know, how much she was even meant to understand about the world she had suddenly been thrust into. Rosalind seemed to sense her uncertainty and offered information freely as she helped Elena dress. "The council is made up of representatives from each of the 8 packs," Rosalind explained. "They oversee matters of law and tradition alongside the king. Bond recognition ceremonies are rare enough that most of the current council has never witnessed one, so there will be a great deal of interest, I'm afraid." "Interest," Elena repeated, feeling a fresh wave of nervousness settle over her. "You mean scrutiny?" Rosalind's expression turned sympathetic. "I won't lie to you, my lady. Some among the council value tradition very strongly, and an Omega rising to such a position will surprise many of them. But His Majesty's word carries great weight, and the bond itself cannot be denied or argued against. It is what it is." Elena absorbed this information quietly, as Rosalind finished adjusting the dress, then led her toward a small dining room, where breakfast had been prepared. Cade was already there, seated at the table, and he rose the moment she entered, a gesture of respect that still felt unfamiliar and strange after a lifetime of being overlooked. "You slept well, I hope," he said, gesturing for her to sit. "Better than I expected," Elena admitted, taking the offered seat. "Though I confess, I still feel as though I might wake up at any moment and find myself back in Thornwood Pack." Something in Cade's expression tightened slightly at the mention of her former home. "Rosalind mentioned your circumstances there were difficult." Elena glanced up, surprised that word of her past had already traveled so quickly. "I wouldn't call them difficult, exactly. Just ordinary. For someone like me, Omegas aren't given much consideration in most packs." "That has always struck me as a foolish tradition," Cade said, his voice carrying a note of quiet conviction. "Strength comes in many forms, and rank alone has never determined a person's worth. Not truly. I intend to make that clear today, before the council, and anyone else who cares to listen." Elena studied him for a long moment, searching for any sign of insincerity, any hint that his words were simply meant to comfort rather than reflect genuine belief. She found none. Whatever else remained uncertain about her strange new circumstances, she was beginning to trust that Cade Ashriver meant exactly what he said. The council chamber, when they arrived that afternoon, was an imposing space, tall stone pillars supporting a domed ceiling, long tables arranged in a wide circle where representatives from each pack sat in careful order of standing. Elena felt every eye in the room turn toward her the moment she entered beside Cade, and she forced herself to keep her chin level, her shoulders steady, refusing to shrink beneath the weight of their attention the way she might have once done. An older wolf with graying hair and sharp, assessing eyes rose from his seat as they approached the center of the chamber. "Your Majesty," he said, inclining his head toward Cade, before turning his attention fully to Elena. "And this, I presume, is the young woman in question." "This is Elena," Cade said, his tone leaving no room for argument or dismissal. "My fated mate, confirmed beyond any doubt." The older wolf's eyes moved over Elena with obvious appraisal, and though he said nothing overtly disrespectful, Elena could feel the weight of his judgment, the silent calculation of her worth based on nothing more than the scent that marked her as Omega, rather than any quality she might actually possess. "Counselor Ashgrove," Cade said, his voice carrying a note of warning that Elena had not heard from him before. "I trust you have no objections to raise regarding the bond itself. It has been confirmed through proper ritual and cannot be disputed." Ashgrove's jaw tightened slightly, though he inclined his head in what might have been agreement or simple acknowledgement. "The bond cannot be disputed, no. though I imagine some among us will require time to adjust to the idea of an Omega standing beside the throne. Then I suggest they begin adjusting now, Cade replied evenly, because that is precisely what will be happening. Elena remained silent throughout this exchange, uncertain of her place in a conversation that so directly concerned her own future, yet felt entirely out of her hands. She glanced around the chamber, noting the varied expressions on the faces of the assembled council members. Some looked curious, even sympathetic. Others, like Ashgrove, seemed guarded, unconvinced, perhaps even resentful of a tradition being challenged so directly. One counselor in particular caught her attention, a younger alpha with dark hair and cold, calculating eyes, who watched the proceedings with an expression Elena could not quite read. He said nothing throughout the exchange, but something about his careful stillness made her uneasy, in a way she could not fully explain. "Draven," Cade said, his eyes moving toward the silent counselor, as if sensing Elena's unease. "You've been quiet. Do you have thoughts to share?" The man called Draven offered a smile that did not quite reach his eyes. "None that would change anything, Your Majesty. The bond speaks for itself, as you say. I only hope your chosen mate proves equal to the demands of her new position." The comment was polite on its surface, yet Elena felt the subtle edge beneath it, a challenge disguised as courtesy. She met his gaze steadily, refusing to let her nervousness show, and something in his expression flickered briefly, perhaps surprise at her composure, before smoothing back into practiced neutrality. The remainder of the council meeting passed in a formal discussion of procedures and timelines, matters Elena understood only partially, though she listened carefully, determined to learn as much as she could about the world she now found herself part of. By the time the meeting concluded, her head ached with new information, and she felt an exhaustion that had little to do with physical tiredness. As they walked together back toward the private wing of the palace, Elena finally allowed herself to voice the question that had been building throughout the meeting. "That Counselor Draven," she said carefully, "is there history between you?" Cade's expression grew thoughtful. Draven has long believed his bloodline deserves greater influence within the 8 packs than it currently holds. He has never openly challenged my rule, but he has made his ambitions known in quieter ways over the years. I would not trust him easily, if that is your question. Elena filed this information away carefully, sensing that it might matter more than either of them yet realized. He didn't seem pleased about the bond recognition. "Few among the ambitious enjoy watching power settle somewhere they cannot control," Cade said, "but you need not concern yourself with Draven's opinions. Whatever objections he holds, they change nothing about what has already been decided by fate itself." Elena wanted to believe that as fully as Cade seemed to, but something about the careful stillness in Draven's eyes stayed with her long after the meeting ended, a quiet unease she could not quite shake, even as the palace settled into evening, and the enormous unfamiliar weight of her new life continued to press down around her. The weeks that followed brought a rhythm to palace life that Elena slowly began to understand, though every day still carried moments that reminded her how far she had traveled from her old existence. She spent mornings with Rosalind, learning the customs and expectations of her new position, and afternoons often found her exploring the palace grounds, drawn instinctively toward the gardens where the scent of growing things reminded her of simpler days. It was during one of these quiet garden walks that she first met old Garrick, the palace's head gardener, a stooped, weathered man, with kind eyes and dirt permanently embedded beneath his fingernails. Elena had knelt to examine a struggling row of herbs, her fingers automatically finding the problem, a lack of proper drainage that was slowly drowning the roots, when she heard a rough chuckle behind her. "Most fine ladies wouldn't dirty their hands like that," Garrick said, watching her with evident curiosity. "I'm not most fine ladies," Elena replied, continuing her work without looking up. "These roots need better drainage, or you'll lose the whole row within the week." Garrick's eyebrows rose in surprise, and he knelt beside her, examining her work with newfound interest. From that day forward, Elena found herself returning to the gardens often, finding a comfort there that the grand halls and formal chambers of the palace could not provide. Garrick, unlike so many others within the palace walls, treated her simply as a person with useful knowledge, rather than as a curiosity to be studied, or a position to be respected out of obligation. Not everyone within the palace shared Garrick's easy acceptance, however. Elena quickly became aware of the whispers that followed her through certain hallways, the sideways glances from nobles who had grown up believing Omegas belonged nowhere near positions of importance. She overheard fragments of conversation not meant for her ears, comments about how she must have manipulated the king somehow, theories about hidden magic or trickery, because surely nothing as significant as a king's mate bond could genuinely form with someone of such low standing. Elena did her best to ignore these whispers, though some nights they lingered in her mind long after she had retired to her chambers, echoes of the same dismissive cruelty she had known her entire life, simply dressed in finer clothing and quieter voices. Cade, for his part, seemed determined to counter these whispers with visible, consistent support. He included her in discussions she might otherwise have been excluded from, sought her opinion on matters both large and small, and made no secret of the growing bond between them, even as it developed slowly and carefully, built on genuine conversation rather than assumption. "You're troubled today," Cade observed one evening, finding Elena seated by a window in the private study they had begun to share, her expression distant as she gazed out over the darkening gardens. "I overheard some of the younger nobles talking earlier," Elena admitted, deciding there was little point in hiding it from him. "They think I schemed my way into this position somehow. One of them suggested I might have used some forbidden charm to force the bond." Cade's jaw tightened, a flash of genuine anger crossing his features before he carefully controlled it. Ignorance and jealousy make people say foolish things. The bond cannot be forced or manufactured, not by charm or scheme or any other trick. Anyone with proper understanding of pack tradition knows this. "I know that," Elena said quietly. "But knowing it doesn't make the words hurt any less." Cade moved closer, settling into the seat across from her, his expression softening into something gentler. "I could address this publicly, if you wished. Make it clear to the entire court that such talk will not be tolerated." Elena considered this offer for a long moment. Part of her wanted exactly that, wanted the protection and validation his authority could provide. But another part of her, the part shaped by years of learning to stand on her own despite constant dismissal, felt a different pull entirely. "I appreciate that," she said finally, "but I think I'd rather prove them wrong through my own actions than have you silence them on my behalf. If I hide behind your authority every time someone doubts me, I'll never truly belong here in my own right." Something shifted in Cade's expression, admiration mixing with the affection that had been steadily growing between them since her arrival. "You continue to surprise me, Elena. Most in your position would welcome the protection without hesitation." "I spent my whole life being told I wasn't worth protecting," Elena said simply. "I'd rather earn respect than have it handed to me because of who stands beside me." In the days that followed, Elena began seeking out opportunities to demonstrate exactly the kind of strength she believed in, though never in the dramatic, obvious ways the court might have expected. She spent time with the palace's kitchen staff, many of whom were themselves Omegas treated with the same casual dismissal she had known in Thornwood Pack, and found ways to ease their burdens, advocating quietly for better treatment and fairer conditions. She visited the healer's quarters, where her knowledge of herbs, gathered through years of necessity, rather than formal education, proved surprisingly valuable. The head healer, an older beta woman named Wren, was initially skeptical of Elena's presence, but quickly grew to respect the practical knowledge Elena brought with her. Knowledge born from real experience, rather than theoretical study. Word of these quiet efforts began to spread slowly through the palace, whispered not with the same dismissive cruelty as before, but with a grudging kind of respect that Elena had never expected to earn, and certainly never expected to earn so quickly. Even some of the nobles who had initially doubted her began to reconsider their assumptions, watching as she moved through the palace with quiet competence and genuine kindness that seemed to disarm even the most stubborn skeptics. Draven, however, remained conspicuously unmoved by this shifting tide of opinion. Elena encountered him occasionally in the palace halls, always polite on the surface, always carrying that same careful, calculating stillness that made her instincts prickle with unease. He never said anything overtly threatening, never gave her concrete reason for suspicion, yet something about his presence continued to unsettle her in ways she struggled to articulate even to herself. "You watch him carefully," Cade observed one evening, noticing the way Elena's attention had drifted toward Draven's retreating figure during a formal gathering. "He unsettles me," Elena admitted. "I can't explain exactly why. He's never rude, never disrespectful. But something about him feels wrong, like he's always calculating, always waiting for something. Cade's expression grew serious. Trust your instincts on this. Omegas are often more perceptive than they're given credit for, sensing things others miss entirely. If Draven troubles you, there is likely good reason. What do you think he's waiting for? Elena asked. I don't know, Cade admitted, but I intend to find out before it becomes a problem we cannot easily solve. Neither of them could have known, in that quiet evening conversation, just how soon that problem would arrive, or how close Draven's careful, patient scheming had already come to threatening everything Elena had begun, slowly and carefully, to build for herself within the palace walls. The formal bond ceremony was scheduled for the following month, a grand event that would make Elena's position beside Cade official in the eyes of every pack across the kingdom. As the date approached, Elena found herself caught between excitement and a persistent, nagging worry she could not fully explain. A feeling that something was moving beneath the surface of palace life that she could not yet see clearly. Draven had grown quieter in recent weeks, no longer appearing at every formal gathering, spending less time in the halls where Elena might encounter him. She mentioned this change to Cade one evening, expecting perhaps that it might ease her concerns, but instead, it seemed to deepen them. Absence isn't always a good sign, Cade said thoughtfully, pacing slowly across their private study. I've had my own people watching him quietly. He's been meeting more frequently with several alphas from the northern territories, wolves, whose loyalty has always been somewhat uncertain. Do you think he's planning something against you? Elena asked. Perhaps, Cade admitted, or perhaps against you, as a way of striking at me indirectly. Removing you would weaken my standing with the packs who still cling to old traditions about Omega worth, and it would certainly satisfy whatever ambitions Draven has been nursing all these years. The thought sent a chill through Elena that had nothing to do with the cool evening air. She had grown, slowly and carefully, into a life she had never imagined possible, and the idea of losing it, of being torn away from Cade and everything she had begun building for herself, frightened her more than she wanted to admit. What can we do? She asked. Continue as we have been, Cade said. Remain visible, remain strong, and give him no opportunity to act without consequence. I have increased the guard around the palace, particularly near your quarters. Whatever he intends, I do not believe he will act rashly. He is patient, and patience means he is still waiting for the right moment. Elena tried to take comfort in these precautions, though the underlying unease remained, a quiet hum beneath the surface of her days that she could not fully silence no matter how she tried to focus on more pleasant matters. In the meantime, life continued, and Elena found herself increasingly drawn into the responsibilities that came with her position. She began accompanying Cade to meetings with representatives from the smaller packs, listening carefully as they discussed matters of trade, territory, and law. She found, to her own surprise, that she had opinions worth sharing, perspectives shaped by years of living among those the great packs so often overlooked, insights that Cade himself valued, and sometimes actively sought out. You see things differently than my advisors, Cade told her one afternoon, after she had raised concerns about a proposed trade agreement that would have disproportionately burdened the smaller, poorer packs. Most of them have never known hardship. You understand what it means to struggle, and that understanding makes your counsel more valuable than they realize. Elena flushed slightly at the praise, still unaccustomed to having her thoughts treated as valuable rather than dismissed. I only know what it's like to be overlooked. It doesn't feel like much of a qualification. It's precisely the qualification this kingdom needs more of, Cade said firmly. Their relationship, born from an instant, overwhelming bond neither of them had chosen, continued to deepen through these smaller moments, quiet conversations and shared meals, walks through the garden, where Elena's knowledge of herbs and growing things gave her a confidence that matched Cade's natural authority in every other setting. She found herself, almost without noticing, beginning to trust him completely, not simply because fate had bound them together, but because he had proven himself, again and again, to be exactly the kind of person his reputation suggested. 2 weeks before the formal ceremony, Elena received an unexpected visitor. A messenger arrived at the palace gates carrying a letter sealed with the Thornwood Pack crest, and Elena's stomach twisted with unease as she broke the seal and began to read. The letter was from Marla, written in careful, formal language that felt entirely foreign coming from a woman who had spent years speaking to Elena with barely concealed contempt. Marla wrote of her pride in Elena's new position, expressed hope that family ties might be maintained despite the distance now between them, and, in language that grew increasingly transparent the further Elena read, hinted at the possibility of Ivy or Bree finding suitable positions within the palace court, given their connection to the new queen. Elena set the letter down slowly, feeling a strange mixture of emotions she struggled to untangle. Part of her felt a flare of old resentment, remembering years of dismissal and cruelty now conveniently forgotten in the face of her sudden importance. Another part of her, quieter but persistent, wondered if there might be some value in extending an olive branch, if only to prove to herself that she had truly moved beyond the pain of her old life, rather than simply carrying it forward in silent bitterness. She showed the letter to Cade that evening, uncertain how he would respond. "What do you want to do?" he asked, after reading it carefully. "I don't know," Elena admitted honestly. "Part of me wants nothing to do with them ever again, but another part of me wonders if refusing them entirely would make me no different from the way they treated me, dismissing people because of old grievances rather than giving them any chance to change." "That is a generous instinct," Cade said, "though not one you owe them, regardless of what choice you make. Whatever you decide, I will support it." Elena thought about this for several days before finally deciding on a response. She wrote back to Marla, polite but carefully measured, neither inviting nor entirely rejecting the possibility of future contact, making clear that any relationship going forward would need to be built on genuine respect rather than convenient opportunism. She did not mention Ivy or Bree's potential positions at all, deciding that some boundaries were worth establishing clearly from the very beginning. Sending that letter felt, in a small but significant way, like closing one chapter of her life and stepping fully into another, no longer defined by the family that had never truly valued her, but by the choices she was beginning to make for herself, in a life that finally felt like it belonged to her. She did not yet know how soon those quiet, carefully built foundations would be tested, or how close Draven's patient scheming had already come to putting everything she had built at terrible risk. The morning of the formal bond ceremony arrived clear and bright, the entire capital alive with preparations that had been underway for weeks. Elena stood in her chambers as Rosalind made final adjustments to a gown of pale silver, the fabric catching the light with every small movement, and tried to steady the nervous energy that had been building inside her since she woke before dawn. "You look every bit as regal as any alpha born to the position," Rosalind said, stepping back to admire her work. "Nobody watching today will doubt for a moment that you belong exactly where you are standing." Elena managed a small smile, though the nervousness remained. "I hope you're right." "There are still plenty who would disagree, I imagine." "Fewer than you think," Rosalind assured her. "You've earned more respect these past weeks than you realize. The kitchen staff speak of you constantly, and Healer Wren tells anyone who will listen how valuable your knowledge has proven. Word travels, my lady, even among those who once doubted you." The ceremony itself was to take place in the same grand courtyard where Elena had first encountered Cade weeks before, though this time there would be no hiding, no running, no possibility of slipping away unnoticed into the crowd. This time, she would stand at the very center of everyone's attention, formally recognized before the assembled representatives of all 8 packs as the Alpha King's chosen mate. As the hour approached, Elena made her way toward the courtyard, flanked by attendants and guards, her heart pounding with a mixture of anticipation and lingering nervousness that she doubted would ever fully disappear. The courtyard, when she arrived, was even more crowded than she remembered from the original ceremony, banners and flowers decorating every visible surface, the assembled crowd buzzing with quiet, excited conversation that fell into respectful silence as she made her entrance. Cade waited for her at the center of the courtyard, dressed in formal attire that somehow made him look even more commanding than usual, though his expression softened into something warmer and more personal the moment his eyes found hers across the crowd. Elena walked toward him slowly, acutely aware of every eye upon her, yet finding, to her own surprise, that she no longer felt the overwhelming urge to flee that had gripped her so completely during their first meeting. "You came," Cade said softly as she reached him, a small, private smile crossing his features. "I did," Elena replied, matching his smile with one of her own, "though I confess my legs feel rather unsteady." "Mine as well," Cade admitted quietly, "though I suspect we hide it well enough." The ceremony itself followed ancient traditions Elena had spent weeks learning, careful rituals, meant to formally bind two fated mates before witnesses from every corner of the kingdom. An elder priestess stepped forward to guide them through the ceremonial words, and Elena found herself speaking the required vows with a steadiness that surprised even her voice carrying clearly across the silent courtyard. As the ceremony reached its final moments, the elder priestess called for any objections to be raised, a formality Elena had been told rarely produced any response beyond respectful silence. She held her breath regardless, some instinct warning her that this particular tradition might not pass so smoothly. For a long, tense moment, silence held across the courtyard. Then, from somewhere near the front of the assembled crowd, a voice rose clearly, carrying easily across the quiet space. "I object," Draven said, stepping forward with careful, measured confidence. A ripple of shocked murmurs moved through the crowd. Elena felt Cade's hand tighten protectively around hers, his entire posture shifting into something harder, more dangerous, though his expression remained carefully controlled as he addressed the interruption. "On what grounds, Counselor Ashgrove?" Cade asked, his voice carrying a warning that Elena could feel rather than simply hear. "On what grounds, Draven?" Cade asked, his voice sharp and controlled. Draven's expression remained maddeningly calm, almost pleasant, as he addressed the crowd rather than Cade directly, clearly aware that his words were meant for a much wider audience than simply the king himself. "I raise this objection not out of disrespect for tradition, but out of concern for it. Bonds of this significance have historically required verification beyond simple recognition. I propose that before this union is finalized, the Council conduct a formal review of the bond's authenticity, given the unprecedented nature of an Omega rising to such a position." Elena felt her stomach drop, understanding immediately that this was no simple procedural concern, but a calculated attempt to delay, perhaps even prevent entirely, the recognition she and Cade had worked so carefully toward. She glanced at Cade, and saw the same understanding reflected in his tightly controlled expression. "The bond has already been confirmed through proper ritual," Cade said, his voice carrying clearly across the courtyard. "This objection has no legal foundation." "With respect, Your Majesty," Draven replied smoothly, "tradition allows any council member to request verification when circumstances are sufficiently unprecedented, and I believe most here would agree that an Omega ascending to the throne qualifies as exactly that." Murmurs of agreement rose from certain sections of the crowd, older wolves and traditionalists who had never fully accepted the idea of Elena's new position, their whispered support giving Draven's objection more weight than Elena had hoped it might carry. She felt panic beginning to rise in her chest, the old, familiar fear of being found unworthy, threatening to overwhelm the careful confidence she had spent weeks building. But then, unexpectedly, another voice rose from the crowd, cutting through the murmurs with quiet, steady authority. "I would speak in support of the bond's authenticity," Healer Wren called out, stepping forward from among the assembled witnesses. "I have worked alongside Lady Elena these past weeks, and witnessed firsthand the depth of her knowledge and character. Whatever her rank, her worth cannot reasonably be questioned by anyone who has actually taken the time to know her." Before the murmurs could settle, another voice joined hers, one of the kitchen staff Elena had quietly advocated for in recent weeks, followed by old Garrick, his weathered voice carrying surprising strength as he spoke of Elena's genuine knowledge and kindness. One by one, voices rose from unexpected corners of the crowd, ordinary palace workers and staff who had come to know Elena not as a curiosity or a political concern, but as a person worthy of genuine respect. Elena felt tears threatening at the corners of her eyes, overwhelmed by this unexpected show of support from people she had never imagined would speak so publicly on her behalf. She glanced toward Draven and saw, for just a moment, a flicker of genuine surprise crossing his carefully composed features, before he schooled his expression back into practiced neutrality. "The bond has been confirmed through proper ritual," Cade said again, his voice carrying renewed strength, as the crowd's growing support bolstered his position. "And it seems the character of my chosen mate speaks for itself, far more eloquently than any council review could accomplish. This ceremony will proceed as planned." Draven's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but he offered a shallow bow of acknowledgement, retreating back into the crowd without further argument, though the calculating stillness in his eyes told Elena clearly that this was far from the end of whatever scheme he had been quietly building. The ceremony concluded without further interruption, and as Cade formally declared Elena his recognized mate before the assembled witnesses, a wave of applause and celebration rose through the courtyard, drowning out whatever lingering doubts remained among the traditionalists who had supported Draven's objection. But even as she smiled and accepted the congratulations of those around her, even as Cade's hand remained warm and steady in her own, Elena could not shake the certainty that Draven's public objection had been only the opening move in a much larger game, one whose true stakes she was only beginning to understand. In the days following the ceremony, palace life settled into what appeared to be a peaceful new rhythm. Elena, now formally recognized as Cade's mate before the entire kingdom, found herself treated with a level of respect that continued to feel almost surreal after a lifetime of dismissal. Yet beneath this surface calm, both she and Cade remained watchful, aware that Draven's public objection had likely been only the visible portion of a much deeper scheme. Cade increased security measures throughout the palace, though he did so carefully, unwilling to reveal how seriously he took the threat Draven posed. Elena, for her part, continued her quiet work among the palace staff and healers, though she found herself glancing more frequently over her shoulder, an old, familiar wariness returning despite her best efforts to remain confident and unafraid. "You've grown quiet again," Cade observed one evening, finding her seated in their private study, a book open before her that she had not actually been reading. "I keep thinking about Draven," Elena admitted, "about what he might be planning. He didn't seem like someone who accepts defeat easily." "He isn't," Cade agreed grimly. "I've had additional reports these past days. He's continued meeting with the Alphas from the Northern Territories, and now with several council members who supported his objection during the ceremony. Whatever he's building it carefully." "Do you think he means to challenge you directly?" Elena asked. Cade considered this for a long moment. "Perhaps eventually. But I suspect his more immediate target remains you. Removing you would weaken my standing without requiring him to directly challenge my authority, a safer path for someone as calculating as Draven has always been." The thought settled uneasily in Elena's chest, though she forced herself to remain outwardly calm. She had faced worse fears in her life, she reminded herself, years of uncertainty and dismissal that had taught her resilience even when circumstances felt overwhelming. She would not allow Draven's quiet scheming to undo the confidence she had worked so hard to build. Nearly a week later, Elena received an unexpected invitation, delivered by a young page who claimed it came from a group of Omega representatives from the Northern Territories, hoping to meet privately to discuss concerns about their treatment within their home packs. The invitation requested a quiet meeting away from the palace's formal halls, in a garden pavilion near the eastern wall, citing a desire for privacy given the sensitivity of the concerns they wished to raise. Elena felt a flicker of genuine interest at the invitation, remembering her own years of quiet suffering, and wanting desperately to help others facing similar circumstances. She mentioned the invitation to Cade, who frowned thoughtfully upon hearing the details. "I don't like it," he said. "It's unusual for such a request to arrive without going through proper channels first. Perhaps they're simply nervous about being seen, requesting help too openly," Elena suggested. "You know how difficult it can be for Omegas to advocate for themselves, especially within more traditional packs." Cade remained unconvinced, but Elena's genuine desire to help outweighed her own lingering caution, and after careful discussion, they agreed she would attend the meeting, though with additional guards stationed discreetly nearby, a compromise that eased some of Cade's concern, without denying Elena the chance to potentially help others in need. The Eastern Garden Pavilion was quiet and secluded when Elena arrived the following afternoon, shaded by tall trees and surrounded by carefully tended flower beds that reminded her pleasantly of her own quiet time spent with old Garrick. She waited alone for several minutes, growing increasingly uncertain as the appointed time passed without anyone arriving to meet her. It was the subtle shift in the air, a familiar prickling awareness she had come to recognize as the sense of being watched, that finally alerted her that something was wrong. She turned quickly, scanning the surrounding trees, and caught a brief glimpse of movement before several figures emerged from the shadows, moving with the coordinated precision of trained soldiers, rather than the nervous hesitation of Omega representatives seeking quiet counsel. Elena's heart began to pound as she recognized, among the approaching figures, the unmistakable presence of Draven himself. stepping forward with the same calm, calculating composure she had come to associate with genuine danger. "I apologize for the deception," Draven said, his voice carrying none of its usual careful courtesy. "But I find directness rarely produces the results I require. You've become something of an inconvenience, Lady Elena, and I'm afraid that inconvenience needs to be resolved." Elena backed away instinctively, her mind racing as she assessed her surroundings, searching desperately for any avenue of escape, or any hope that Cade's hidden guards might notice what was happening quickly enough to intervene. "Cade will know it was you," she said, forcing steadiness into her voice despite the fear rising rapidly in her chest. "There's no way to hide something like this." "Perhaps not entirely," Draven admitted, gesturing for his companions to move closer, forming a slowly tightening circle around her. "But by the time anyone discovers the truth, the bond that has caused so much unnecessary disruption to proper tradition will already be broken beyond repair. There are older rituals, Lady Elena, forbidden by current law but not entirely forgotten, capable of severing even a confirmed bond if performed correctly. Once that is accomplished, your usefulness to anyone will end rather quickly." Fear threatened to overwhelm Elena's thoughts, but beneath that fear, something else began to stir, a quiet, steady resolve that had carried her through years of hardship and dismissal, refusing now to simply surrender without resistance. She thought of everything she had built these past weeks, the respect she had earned, the genuine connection she had formed with Cade, the quiet dignity she had reclaimed after a lifetime of being told she was worthless. She would not let it be taken from her without a fight. As Draven's men closed the final distance between them, Elena's mind raced through every possibility, every scrap of knowledge she had gathered during her time in the palace, searching desperately for some way to buy time, some way to resist long enough for help to arrive before Draven's forbidden ritual could take hold. The men closed in around Elena, and she felt rough hands seize her arms before she could react, dragging her toward a waiting carriage, hidden behind the pavilion's tall hedges. She struggled against their grip, kicking and twisting with every ounce of strength she possessed, but the soldiers were trained and strong, and within moments, she found herself bound and forced into the carriage, Draven settling into the seat across from her with an expression of calm satisfaction. "You'll regret this," Elena said through gritted teeth, refusing to let her fear show any more than absolutely necessary. "Cade will find me, and when he does, there will be no mercy for what you've done." "Perhaps," Draven replied, unbothered. "But by then, it will already be finished. The ritual requires only a short journey from here, to a location where forgotten traditions are still remembered. Once the bond is severed, you will simply be an inconvenient former servant, with no claim to anything, and I doubt the king will spend much effort chasing after someone who no longer matters to his position." Elena said nothing further, conserving her energy, watching carefully as the carriage rattled along unfamiliar roads, memorizing every landmark she could manage to glimpse through the small window, desperate for any information that might prove useful later. The journey lasted nearly 2 hours before the carriage finally stopped at a secluded clearing, deep within a dense forest, far from any road Elena recognized. She was pulled roughly from the carriage and marched toward a circle of ancient standing stones, weathered by centuries of exposure, arranged in a pattern that radiated an unsettling energy even Elena, with no formal training in such matters, could sense clearly. "An old place," Draven explained, almost conversationally, as his men began preparing the ritual space around her. "Forgotten by most, though not by those who bothered to study the older traditions our current laws have chosen to abandon. Fitting, don't you think, that something as inconvenient as your bond should be undone in a place equally inconvenient to modern sensibilities?" Elena remained silent, her mind working furiously as she watched the preparations unfold around her. She noticed details she might otherwise have overlooked, the careful positioning of certain stones, the specific herbs being arranged in patterns she vaguely recognized from her own studies with healer Ren, patterns that seemed designed to focus and direct some kind of power she did not fully understand, but instinctively feared. As the ritual preparations neared completion, Draven approached her with a small ceremonial blade, and something inside Elena shifted, a desperate, defiant energy rising up from someplace deep within her that she had never fully accessed before. She thought of every moment she had been dismissed, every cruelty endured in silence, every time she had been told she was too weak, too worthless, too insignificant to matter. she would not go quietly into whatever fate Draven intended for her. As Draven raised the blade, beginning to speak words in an old, unfamiliar language, Elena felt something building inside her chest, a pressure unlike anything she had ever experienced, rising up through her throat until it demanded release. Without fully understanding what she was doing, she opened her mouth and let out a sound that was not quite a scream, not quite a howl, but something older and deeper, a command woven into pure sound that seemed to reach into the very core of everyone standing nearby. The effect was immediate and startling. Draven's men, mid-motion in their ritual preparations, froze completely, their expressions going slack with confusion, as if some fundamental part of their will had simply ceased to respond to their own commands. Even Draven himself staggered backward, the ceremonial blade slipping from suddenly nerveless fingers, his composed expression shattering into genuine shock. Elena did not fully understand what had just happened, only that some instinct deep within her, something she had never known existed, had responded to her desperate need with a power that felt both entirely foreign and somehow completely her own. She had heard whispered legends among the palace staff, old stories about a rare gift called the Voice, said to exist among the earliest Omegas before the rank had become so thoroughly diminished by centuries of dismissive tradition. She had never imagined, not for a single moment, that such a legend might apply to her. Impossible, Draven breathed, staring at her with an expression that mixed disbelief with something close to genuine fear. Elena did not wait for him to recover. Using the momentary confusion gripping his men, she twisted free of her loosened bonds and ran, not toward the road she had glimpsed earlier, but deeper into the forest, trusting her instincts to guide her toward safety, while Draven and his men remained disoriented by whatever strange power had just erupted from within her. She had not run far before she heard the sound of approaching horses, and for a terrifying moment, she feared Draven's men had recovered enough to pursue her. But as the riders broke through the tree line, she recognized, with a flood of overwhelming relief, the unmistakable figure of Cade at their head, his expression a mixture of fury and desperate concern, as his eyes found her standing alone among the trees. "Elena," he called out, dismounting before his horse had even fully stopped, closing the distance between them in a few long strides. "Are you hurt? What happened?" "I'm all right," Elena managed, though her voice shook with the aftermath of adrenaline and fear. "Draven, he brought me here. Some kind of ritual, meant to break the bond. But something happened, I don't understand it myself, some kind of power that stopped them, gave me the chance to escape." Cade's expression shifted rapidly from relief to controlled fury as he processed her words, turning immediately to address the soldiers who had accompanied him. "He does not leave this forest a free man." The soldiers moved quickly toward the clearing Elena had fled, and within minutes, they emerged with Draven and his remaining men bound and subdued, Draven's earlier composure completely shattered, replaced by a defeated resignation that told Elena clearly his scheme had failed entirely. "You'll answer for this before the full council," Cade said, his voice carrying a cold authority that Elena had never heard from him before. Attempted harm against a confirmed royal mate, forbidden ritual practice, conspiracy against the crown itself. "There will be no mercy shown for what you've attempted here today." Draven said nothing, his eyes flickering briefly toward Elena with an expression that mixed genuine fear with something almost like reluctant respect, before he was led away by the soldiers, his ambitions and schemes finally and completely undone. As the immediate danger passed, Cade turned back toward Elena, his expression softening from cold fury into something warmer and more personal, his hands moving gently to cradle her face as he studied her carefully for any sign of lasting harm. "I nearly lost you," he said quietly, his voice rough with emotion he rarely allowed himself to show so openly. "You didn't," Elena said softly, leaning into his touch. "I'm still here. Whatever power saved you today," Cade said, "I owe it my deepest gratitude, alongside whatever strength and courage brought you through this ordeal in the first place." Elena thought about the strange, powerful sound that had erupted from her in that desperate moment, still struggling to fully understand what had happened, what it might mean for her future, what other hidden strengths she might carry within herself that a lifetime of dismissal had never given her the chance to discover. Whatever it was, whatever it meant, she understood clearly, standing there in the quiet forest with Cade's hands gentle against her face, that she was no longer the powerless, overlooked Omega she had once believed herself to be. and she never would be again. News of Draven's betrayal spread through the capital within a single day, and by the time the full council convened to address the matter formally, the entire kingdom had already learned of the failed conspiracy against the king's chosen mate. Elena stood beside Cade in the same grand chamber where Draven had once raised his public objection, though this time, the atmosphere carried none of the earlier tension and doubt. The council proceedings were swift and decisive. Draven, along with the soldiers who had assisted him, was formally stripped of his title and standing, his ambitions for greater power ending not in triumph but in complete disgrace before the very council he had once hoped to manipulate. Several of the northern alphas who had quietly supported his scheming found their own standing significantly diminished as well, a clear message sent throughout the 8 packs that such conspiracies would not be tolerated, regardless of rank or ambition. Councillor Ashgrove, who had initially seemed skeptical of Elena's position, rose during the proceedings to offer words Elena had never expected to hear from him. "Whatever doubts I once held about tradition and rank," he said, addressing the assembled council, "I cannot deny what I witnessed today. Lady Elena's courage and, apparently, her remarkable gifts speak far more powerfully than any argument about proper standing ever could. I withdraw my earlier reservations entirely." Elena felt a warmth spread through her chest at these words, a quiet vindication after so many years of being told she was worthless, dismissed simply because of a rank she had never chosen for herself. She glanced toward Cade and saw her own quiet pride reflected in his expression, along with something deeper, an unmistakable love that had grown steadily since that first, overwhelming moment in the crowded courtyard weeks before. In the days following Draven's disgrace, word of Elena's rare gift, the ancient power known as the Voice, spread throughout the kingdom, carried by soldiers and council members who had witnessed its effects firsthand. Scholars from across the 8 packs began arriving at the palace, eager to study this legendary ability, thought lost for generations, and Elena found herself, for the first time in her life, treated not merely as worthy of respect, but as genuinely extraordinary. She approached this newfound attention with the same careful humility that had always defined her, however, refusing to let the sudden praise change the fundamental values she had carried through years of hardship. She continued her work among the palace staff, continued her quiet friendship with old Garrick in the gardens, continued advocating for the overlooked and dismissed members of court, just as she always had, understanding deeply that true worth came not from rare gifts or royal titles, but from the character built through genuine kindness and quiet resilience. Several weeks later, as the last preparations for Elena's formal coronation as Alpha Queen were completed, she received an unexpected visitor at the palace gates. Marla, accompanied by Ivy and Bree, had traveled from Thornwood Pack, requesting an audience that Elena, after some consideration, agreed to grant. The meeting was brief and carefully measured on both sides. Marla offered congratulations that felt somewhat more genuine than her earlier letter had managed, though Elena remained cautious, unwilling to fully forget the years of dismissal that had shaped so much of her early life. Ivy and Bree, chastened by circumstances that had forced them to reconsider their earlier cruelty, offered awkward but seemingly sincere apologies, acknowledging, however reluctantly, that they had misjudged Elena's worth for years. Elena listened to their words carefully, weighing them against everything she had learned about genuine character during her time in the palace. She did not offer immediate forgiveness, nor did she extend the kind of warm welcome that might have suggested the past could simply be forgotten entirely. Instead, she offered something more measured, an acknowledgement that people could change, paired with a clear expectation that any future relationship would need to be built on genuine respect rather than convenient opportunism, now that circumstances had shifted so dramatically. "I hope," she told them before they departed, "that you've learned something from all of this, not simply that I have value now because of my position, but that everyone carries worth, regardless of rank or circumstance. That lesson matters far more than anything that has happened to me personally." Whether they truly absorbed this lesson, Elena could not say with certainty, though she felt a quiet peace in having spoken her truth clearly, no longer bound by the silence and fear that had once defined so much of her relationship with her stepfamily. The coronation itself took place on a bright, clear morning, the same courtyard that had witnessed both her first, terrified encounter with Cade, and Draven's later, failed objection, now filled with a crowd united in genuine celebration, rather than uncertain skepticism. Elena stood at the center of that vast gathering, dressed in robes befitting her new title, and felt none of the overwhelming panic that had gripped her during that first ceremony weeks before. As the elder priestess placed the ceremonial crown upon her head, formally recognizing her as Alpha Queen of the Eight Packs, Elena looked out over the assembled crowd, remembering with sudden clarity the frightened young woman who had once hidden at the edges of this very courtyard, certain she would never be seen, never be valued, never be anything more than an overlooked Omega, destined for a life of quiet servitude. That woman felt impossibly distant now, though Elena carried her memory carefully, understanding that every hardship endured had shaped the strength and character that now allowed her to stand confidently before an entire kingdom. "Today," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the silent courtyard, addressing the crowd with words she had carefully considered in the days leading up to this moment, "I stand before you not simply as the king's chosen mate, but as living proof that worth cannot be measured by rank alone. I was told, for most of my life, that being an Omega made me lesser, unworthy of respect or consideration. I stand here today to say clearly that such beliefs are wrong, and that every person within these 8 packs, regardless of rank, deserves the chance to prove their true character." A wave of applause rose through the courtyard, genuine and enthusiastic, and Elena felt Cade's hand find hers, warm and steady, as they stood together before their kingdom, two people bound not merely by an extraordinary fated bond, but by genuine love and mutual respect built carefully over the weeks since that first overwhelming meeting. As the celebration continued around them, Elena allowed herself, finally and completely, to embrace the life fate had chosen for her, no longer the mocked and overlooked Omega cast aside by those who never understood her true worth, but the Alpha Queen, who had transformed not only her own destiny, but the very traditions that had once sought to keep her small. She had been rejected, dismissed, and cast aside more times than she could count throughout her early life. But standing there beside Cade, crowned before a kingdom that had finally learned to see her true worth, Elena understood with complete certainty that every hardship had led her exactly to where she was always meant to be, not by chance, but by a fate that had recognized her strength long before she had recognized it herself.